Salam sejahtera, anda bersama saya Rozman. Seperti biasa jam ini kami akan bawakan pelbagai rangkuman berita niaga ekonomi dari peringkat tempatan hinggalah ke antarabangsa dalam segmen Niaga Awani, dan kita akan mulakan dengan perkembangan ini dahulu dengan Perdana Menteri Datuk Seri Anwar Ibrahim menegaskan keperluan melaksanakan program perlindungan sosial secara inklusif merangkumi seluruh negara dan semua segmen masyarakat. Anwar yang juga Menteri Kewangan berkata pendekatan inklusif itu merangkumi penyediaan perkhidmatan penting seperti pusat rehabilitasi serta semakan semula undang-undang dan peraturan berkaitan supaya pelaksanaan inisiatif dapat dipercepat dan memberi impak terbaik kepada rakyat. Dalam mesyuarat Majlis Perlindungan Sosial Malaysia MySPC kali ke-9 Bil 2 tahun 2025 yang dipengerusikan beliau, Anwar berkata mesyuarat tersebut adalah bagi memperkukuh penyelarasan dasar dan pelaksanaan agenda perlindungan sosial negara. Mesyuarat turut mengambil maklum penambahbaikan sistem pangkalan data utama padu yang dipacu Kementerian Ekonomi serta pembentangan kertas kerja oleh Pertubuhan Keselamatan Sosial PERKESO, Bank Dunia dan Kementerian Ekonomi dalam usaha memperkukuh ekosistem perlindungan sosial negara. Pada mesyuarat itu, Perdana Menteri turut mengucapkan tahniah kepada PERKESO atas pelantikan semula sebagai Presiden Persatuan Keselamatan Sosial Antarabangsa ISSA bagi penggal 2026 hingga 2028 yang disifatkan sebagai pengiktirafan besar buat Malaysia di pentas global. Beliau turut menghargai penerbitan Statistik Perlindungan Sosial Malaysia 2024 sebagai rujukan penting dalam meningkatkan keberkesanan penyampaian dasar kepada rakyat di seluruh negara. Kerajaan sedang mempertimbangkan beberapa elemen utama antaranya skop pelepasan gas rumah hijau GHG yang akan dikenakan cukai, paras harga karbon yang sesuai serta nilai ambang pelepasan bagi pembentukan kerangka cukai karbon. Kementerian Kewangan MOF menjelaskan semua elemen utama itu akan menentukan fasiliti yang tertakluk kepada pengenaan cukai karbon. Menurut MOF, turut diberi perhatian ialah pembangunan sistem pemantauan dan pelaporan pelepasan MRV yang telus, efisien dan diyakini oleh industri serta pelabur. Selain itu, integrasi mekanisme cukai karbon dengan pasaran karbon domestik dan potensi pelaksanaan ETS skim dagangan pelepasan adalah penting bagi menyediakan fleksibiliti pematuhan serta mengurangkan kos pengawalan pelepasan kepada industri. MOF berkata demikian dalam jawapan bertulis Dewan Negara yang disiarkan di laman sesawang Parlimen pada Selasa bagi menjawab soalan Senator Datuk Wu Him Ven berkenaan reka bentuk cukai karbon yang disusun oleh MOF supaya Malaysia menjadi hub perdagangan karbon serantau. Wu juga bertanyakan sama ada MOF bercadang mempertimbangkan kadar cukai permulaan lebih rendah bagi penentusahan dan pembangunan projek. Antara lain pemberian kredit cukai kepada pelaburan dalam infrastruktur pemerangkapan, penggunaan dan penyimpanan karbon dan perdagangan karbon bagi menarik kewangan hijau dan memperkukuh pasaran kredit karbon berintegriti tinggi. Menurut MOF, selaras dengan komitmen Malaysia untuk mencapai sasaran sifar bersih karbon menjelang 2050, kerajaan sedang membangunkan instrumen penetapan harga karbon sebagai langkah utama untuk memperkukuh dasar perubahan iklim negara. Pengenalan cukai karbon turut disepadukan dengan strategi penyahkarbonan industri negara dan keperluan mengekalkan daya saing ekonomi dalam konteks global, khususnya berikutan pengenalan Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism CBAM oleh Kesatuan Eropah EU bermula 2026. MOF memaklumkan dalam merangka mekanisme cukai karbon, pihaknya sedang meneliti model dan amalan terbaik negara yang telah melaksanakan harga karbon dengan berkesan seperti Switzerland, EU dan Kanada. Pada masa sama, penelitian turut dibuat terhadap pengalaman negara-negara serantau seperti Indonesia, Singapura, Thailand dan Vietnam yang sedang memperkenalkan cukai karbon atau ETS secara berperingkat. Jelasnya, kajian perbandingan ini penting bagi memastikan struktur cukai karbon Malaysia mengambil kira ekosistem industri tempatan, mengekalkan daya saing ekonomi serta mengurangkan risiko kebocoran karbon. Rangka kerja cukai karbon yang sedang dibangunkan turut diselaraskan dengan perundangan dan dasar berkaitan yang sedang digubal oleh Kementerian Sumber Asli dan Kelestarian Alam NRES, termasuk Rang Undang-Undang Perubahan Iklim Negara dan Dasar Pasaran Karbon Kebangsaan DPKK. ICOS Systems bercadang untuk melabur di Malaysia bagi mengembangkan pembuatan komponen penting seperti blok keluli tahan karat dan kelengkapan yang digunakan dalam peralatan fabrikasi wafer semikonduktor. Pengerusi Lembaga Pembangunan Pelaburan Malaysia MIDA, Tengku Datuk Seri Zafrul Abdul Aziz berkata, pelaburan strategi itu akan bawa aktiviti pembuatan berketetapan tinggi ke negara ini, sekaligus mengukuhkan kedudukan Malaysia dalam rantaian bekalan semikonduktor global.
Ujar beliau, langkah ini sejaja dengan objektif strategi semikonduktor nasional NSS untuk menjadikan Malaysia sebagai hub pembuatan maju dan menjana peluang pekerjaan berpendapatan tinggi. Beliau berkata demikian dalam perkongsian di media sosial selepas bertemu dengan wakil iCore System di Singapura pada Selasa. Mengulas lanjut, Tengku Zafrul berkata, pelaburan tersebut bukan sahaja memperkukuh ekosistem elektrik dan elektronik negara, malah meningkatkan nilai tambah dalam industri semikonduktor. iCore Systems ialah peneraju global dalam reka bentuk dan pembuatan sistem penghantaran cecair dan gas berteknologi tinggi, injap serta kelengkapan untuk peralatan fabrikasi berketulinan tinggi. Tengku Zafrul menegaskan MIDA komited memudah cara pelaksanaan projek ini dan akan bekerjasama rapat dengan pihak berkepentingan bagi memastikan kejayaan pelaburan tersebut.
All right, today we discussed the growing risks of invisible money. Recent reports estimate some 135 billion ringgit sits in Malaysian e-wallets. If account owners die or go offline, families may not be able to access those funds. Joining us is the General Manager APAC Luno Malaysia, Aaron Tang, to discuss how this plays out for crypto and other digital assets and what can be done about it. I want to say thank you very much, Aaron, for joining me. Headlines saying 135 billion ringgit across e-wallets that could become unclaimed. From Luno's perspective, how big a problem is the invisible inheritance issue when it comes to crypto assets? Are you seeing many dormant or inaccessible accounts that could turn into unclaimed assets for heirs?
Morning, Nina. Thank you for having me. So it's quite an interesting problem that you mentioned, because specifically in the digital asset world, actually, this problem has existed for quite a few years I would say, in the unregulated digital asset space. So currently, there are multiple ways to store your digital assets, your crypto. So for example, you could use a regulated platform like Luno. That's the easiest and most convenient way to store your crypto. But for many years, before regulated exchanges came out, people were actually storing their digital assets, crypto, on their hard drives. They were storing it on USB sticks and so on. So actually, back in those days, when people lost access to their USB drive, or they forgot their passwords, or they just switched computers and so on, losing access to cryptocurrency was actually quite a common thing. And you'll see in some of the news headlines in the past, a man has lost 100 million, which is stuck in his hard drive in a trash dump, dump somewhere. So that was what happened years ago. I think interestingly, with the approach of having regulated digital asset exchanges, regulated wallets today, this is one of the ways in which we can solve the problem, because when you work with a regulated exchange and a regulated wallet and so on, if there is a problem with the account, or if somebody passes away, unfortunately, the family can actually approach the crypto exchange, and there are processes in place where the assets can pass on. So it's quite an interesting problem, because it's kind of the other way around in the crypto world. We used to have problems before, but now with regulations, these are changing for the better.
Maybe the consumer, from your explanation, we can see it's a bit complex for them to understand this, because regulation is something that we have to adhere to. And unlike e-wallets tied to phone numbers, crypto depends on keys, private credentials. Can you explain for viewers the practical differences between custodial services, exchanges like Luno, and self-custody, private wallets, particularly in how each model affects and heirs' ability to recover funds after the owner dies?
Sure, definitely, Nina. So at its base, at its base technology, a crypto wallet is a piece of computer code. And to access that crypto wallet, you need what is known as a private key. So a private key is a piece of cryptographic information that with this private key, you would be able to access the funds in your wallet. Now, there are multiple ways to store that private key. Now, something that we mentioned previously, some people prefer to store this privately, and that's totally fine, right? Some people are very, very good technologists. They're able to store that private key in a very secure manner. So maybe they use their very secure computer at home, or maybe they keep it in a safe or so on. So that's one way of storing the crypto assets. Now, the other way of doing it is to use a custodial service. A custodial service is merely a company which is licensed or approved to hold the crypto or digital assets on behalf of the customer. So an example of that would be an exchange like Luno. We are allowed or we are approved to hold the customer's digital assets private wallet, private key. Or there are also licensed digital asset custodians in Malaysia. They are licensed to be able to hold the private keys. So the interesting thing about these private keys is because it grants you access to your digital assets, that means that whoever holds the private key is actually very, very powerful because they actually control the asset. So again, imagine if you were an individual and you lost your private key, there's actually nobody that would be able to save you if you are holding the private key yourself. However, if you're holding the private key with an institution, a licensed institution, so on, anything happens to that private, that institution is responsible for that private key. So with a combination of security features and processes and procedures, the institutions have to make sure that even if you lost your password, for example, the private key is still stored with the company and they will be able to help you retrieve your password and access to your funds.
Other than these errands, what also other concrete features can exchanges implement to reduce the unclaimed risks like nomination fields, beneficiary registrations, dormant account workflows, or secure legacy access processes? And has Luno implemented or piloted any of this?
I think the number one thing that perhaps lacking today, not just for digital assets, I think even in the financial services, is the process of actually transferring assets from one person passing on to their inheritors or the next generation. So I think it starts with that, having a very, very clear policy. So for example, at Luno, we have a very clear defined policy on our website. In the event that somebody has passed on, the process is actually very clear. What documents you need to submit, what documents from the courts that you need to prove that, okay, you are the rightful inheritance and so on. So I think this is something that I think, perhaps it is a bit of a taboo topic, right? Nobody wants to really talk about this, but it's something that I think as an industry, not just ourselves in the crypto industry, but I think all financial institutions, we can continue to spread the word about, raise awareness about how actually the process of passing on is. And it's actually not a very, very, I would say it's not a very overly complex process. The only thing is that it takes time. So it can take quite a long time for the necessary documents to be issued from the courts or from the authorities to be able to prove that, okay, I'm the next of kin and I deserve these assets.
And talking about authorities in between individuals, we're also talking about authority within this platform, within this app, within this digital assets. And as you mentioned, it's not easy for transferring assets because a lot of security that we have to go through and a lot of confirmations. So where does the responsibility sit between providers and regulators? Should regulators like BNM mandate standards for digital asset succession or a nomination registry, which we know that they are doing right now, some of the focus? Or what practical regulatory changes would you like to see to protect consumers and their heirs?
Yeah, this is, I think, the current, often the longest time lag at the moment is getting what we call, I believe it's called the letter of administration or a grant of probate. Now, this document itself is the sort of key document that once you bring this document to a financial institution or you bring it to a company like Luno, then the process of actually giving the funds out to the customer is very fast, right? It can take a matter of days or perhaps a week or two, right? That process is actually quite easy. I think the challenge that we have, and I'm not going to assign blame to any particular party or anything, right? Because it is a complex legacy system from many, many years ago. And these regulations are created with the right intention in mind, right? And these are rules and laws that have been passed on for many, many years. That process of getting that document itself can be quite tedious and lengthy. Well, maybe not tedious, but lengthy in process. So sometimes people say that it can take up to 6 to 12 months if you have a will. Now, you already have a will. It can take you 6 to 12 months after somebody passes on. If you don't have a will, that can take even longer. So again, I'm not a legal expert, but I think if the the infrastructure of the land or in Malaysia, we could find a way to make this process shorter while still being heavily secure and proper, then I think that will greatly improve the process.
And for viewers who hold crypto on exchanges or in your wallet balances, one of the ways for security purpose. You have mentioned that it's very important for us to hold the key credentials. What are some the top 5 practical steps that you recommended today to make sure their loved ones can access those funds?
I think the most important thing, especially if you're using any financial institution, is to have that will that basically explains, okay, what happens, where my assets are. It's not just about Luno, right? It's, you know, I have assets in this bank, this institution, my insurance is this and so on. If people were to clearly define that in a legal document or a will, and I'm not saying that, you know, it has to be a super expensive will with lawyers and so on. I believe there are many financial institutions today that actually allow you to draft out a will for somewhat reasonable price already today, right? So I think that would be something very, very powerful for people, especially when you have dependents, or especially once you reach a certain age, or perhaps once you have a certain amount of assets, right? I think that would be something very powerful to have that will. Now, specifically for customers who may be, custodizing their crypto assets themselves, they have to understand that it is the next level of responsibility. So I think, you know, people have used many ways, for example, having multiple copies of that private key. So for example, they may have one in one bank, they may keep another with their parents' home, or they may keep another with a trusted friend, or so on. And then, of course, having very, very clear instructions for their family members. Okay, if this tragic scenario, or this scenario that nobody wants to talk about, if that happens, what are the steps to be taken? So I think, for example, even if you were to have a will, right, it's not that easy for your next of kin to understand what to do if you don't leave them written instructions. So I think there's the sort of institutional part of it, having the proper documentation, but there's also the communication aspect of it, to talk to your family and loved ones about what happens next.
And talking about what happens next is very important. You also share with us the process of a digital asset. It could be one of the challenges or one of the hardest part of it. And also the process maybe from the legacy, if there's no will or there's any proper document, it may take longer for them to access. But also we have to think of the risk after the family, the loved one receive it. For example, like legacy access mechanism, we can see that can be misused if not designed carefully, for example, by coercion or fraud, or by bypassing AML KYC safeguards. Your recommendation, how does Luno balance providing legitimate hair access while preventing fraud, money laundering, or even identity theft risks?
Yeah, so we are guided by the regulations or the laws of the land. So basically, we follow the same guidelines and principles that are ascribed to financial institutions. So again, the proper letter of administration or grant of probate from the high courts and so on. So these are basically safeguards to ensure that somebody who actually comes, or the administrator who comes to a company like Luno, and we've done this multiple times already. So we have quite a good established process to be able to confidently say that, okay, this is indeed somebody who has passed on. This is indeed someone who did have an account with us, and this is indeed the next of kin that we need to pass the assets on to. And usually what we find is we are not passing the assets on directly to a person, but we're also passing the assets on to an administrator of the estate. So it could be somebody who is also representing the will or a trustee company. So it is quite an established process, but I think practically speaking, ideally we want to get to a place where, you know, perhaps the rules can be further enhanced to make it a smoother and faster process. Because again, like I mentioned, even with a will, it could take 6 to 12 months for the entire process to follow out. And yeah, hopefully we get to a point where, you know, it can be faster and more seamless for the next of kin.
Aaron, before we end our discussion, I want to add one more question. We can say that economists want frozen assets and unclaimed funds can depress productive capital. If Malaysia wants to avoid a new wave of unclaimed digital wealth, what are the things should industry, regulators and civil society do? And what role will Luno play in making sure digital assets are part of responsible estate planning?
Yeah, I think it starts with, again, education and awareness. I think particularly in an industry like us, right, we are, I think the first Bitcoin was 2009. So maybe only about 15, 16 years. It's only really come into the mainstream over the last couple of years. So it's quite hard even for, you know, a 20-year-old or 30-year-old when they're thinking about accumulating wealth to be thinking about things like, oh, estate planning, what happens when I pass on and so on. But I think as the industry matures, this is a matter of us continuing to work together as an industry. You know, for example, right now we have on material on our website, right? Luna, we have material on our website on what happens if somebody passes on and so on. But I mean, I would love to see us take the next step in terms of bringing that message further out to people, not just about crypto assets, right? But to all financial institutions, to all financial assets. How can we, as an industry, continue to promote awareness of responsible estate planning? And I think we also work together with financial advisors and so on. We constantly remind them that, hey, you know, if you store crypto with a company like us, there are policies, there are procedures, and, you know, please also continue to educate and encourage your clients, because I think estate planning, even for me personally, is something that often is an afterthought, but we do need to keep talking about it, and we do need to keep encouraging it.
All right, again, this is very insightful sharing. As you mentioned, invisible inheritance, we can say the number 135 billion across e-wallets. It's not only, we can say, invisible inheritance, but it's also a warning for our future digital assets and a lot more. And again, I would say thank you very much for helping us understand how can we safeguard digital assets in terms of aspect legacy access and even unclaimed e-wallets. And definitely we will have more discussion with this in the future. And again, I say thank you very much and hope to see you again. And all of our discussion you will feature in astrowani.com and across all social media platforms. All right, for the next update, as Agentic AI system accelerate across the industry, AWS is rethinking how products are designed to stay intuitive for a rapidly evolving user base. According to Hector Olmos, Vice President of Design Amazon AWS Solutions, the rise of agentic systems has fundamentally reshaped the creative workflow inside the company.
They make people that are creative like me more technical, and the people that are more technical more creative. So it's the range of how people are able to move is broader, is easier, right? Because the tools make it easy for me to code. I'm an engineer by training, but I'm a very bad coder. I'm terrible at coding. However, now with these tools, I can code faster, and it can create prototypes much faster than before. Then I have my peers, friends that are more engineering focused, and they have an idea sometimes, like something in their head, and they cannot draw, for example. And they can put it into a picture, into a movie, into a photo much faster. So what happens is when you have these two groups that think a little bit different with these tools, you can collaborate much better, much easier, because then I can say, oh, that's what you mean. Or I can show you, can we build it in this way? And that has changed fundamentally how we do the work.
Also, a designer and engineer with 25 years of experience, leads AWS design efforts for Apply AI, including customers-facing solutions built on Amazon Bedrock, Agent Core, and Amazon Connect. As AWS rolls out more autonomous agent capabilities, the challenge is making them powerful enough for experts while remaining accessible for non-technical users. He explained that his team focuses on solution-oriented design, not generate interfaces.
Right, just like the jacket you're wearing right now is a specific purpose for this day. Your t-shirt, however, is a general purpose. Yeah. You can use a t-shirt for any other moment, right? My group designs jackets, not t-shirts. What does that mean? It means that it has a point of view. It means that we know who, we know when, we know where, and we know how. And when we have all these questions, we're able to have a point of view on what that is.
This philosophy guides AWS design for high-stakes use cases such as customer services interactions, fraud reports, or delay flights assistance scenarios where specificity matters. With autonomous AI taking more actions on users' behalf, Olsom stressed the importance of earning trust, not demanding it upfront. Asked how AWS accounts for different skill levels and cultural norms across ASEAN and global markets, almost highlighted empathy as core to the design process. The S&P 500 ended Tuesday, December 9, session slightly lower as investors anticipated that the Federal Reserve would take a hawkish tone even if it cuts interest rates this week, while JP Morgan curbed gains after the biggest US bank warned of hefty expenses for 2026. The Fed kicked off its two-day policy meeting on Tuesday with traders widely expecting a 0.25 percentage point rate cut despite inflation still running above the central bank's 2% target. Policymakers have sent mixed signals about the outlook, with some warning that price pressures could easily re-accelerate, while others have been more concerned about the labour market's health. And Tuesday's Labour Department report did little to clear the air as job openings increased marginally in October, but hiring remained subdued. Separately, a National Federation of Independent Business (NFIB) report show companies intending to create new jobs in the near future. Traders are still pricing in a roughly 87% chance of a 25 basis point rate on Wednesday, according to CME's FedWatch tool. The US 10-year Treasury yield was last up on the day at 4.18%, on track for its fourth straight day of gains. Niaga Awani will be taking a short break. Stay with us and we'll be right back.
Herbal Essences melembutkan dan menyelatkan semula rambut anda dengan 100% pati tumbuhan sebenar seperti minyak argan dan aloe. Menutrisi secara mendalam untuk rambut lembut dan berkilat semula, bebas daripada paraben, parafin dan pewarna. Herbal Essences.
Kini anda boleh stream hiburan tanpa henti dan Netflix hits dengan Astro One.
Mungkin ini permulaan yang terbaik untuk aku fikir dulu.
Kau tak payah nak berlakon dah. Get it together. 빨리 가야 돼.
내가 어떻게 하고 살아요?
나한테 유혹당했거든.
She will be mine.
Today we fight for our future!
Just think, it ties us together forever.
Dapatkan Astro One Entertainment dan Netflix pada harga istimewa di aplikasi My Astro sekarang.
Asia tumpuan utama dunia. Dengan ekonomi yang semakin rancak, pembangunan lestari dan tenaga boleh diperbaharui, apakah pula impak kecerdasan buatan AI dalam perkembangan teknologi dan masa depan pekerjaan? Kami mendalami setiap berita dan cerita. Saksikan diskusi, dialog dan laporan khas di Agenda Awani Asia bersama koresponden khas kami setiap Sabtu 9 malam di semua platform Astro Awani.
Malaysia perlu bergerak daripada sekadar menjadi pusat pembuatan kepada sebuah negara pencipta teknologi chip sendiri yang mampu memberi nilai tambah lebih tinggi kepada dunia. Kerajaan bersetuju untuk mempertimbangkan agar pengusaha bot di Sabah dan Sarawak turut layak menerima subsidi petrol RON 95. Sabah kini memiliki 2 tapak rizab biosfera susulan pengiktirafan diberikan kepada Kinabatangan oleh UNESCO.
More civilians are killed in war today than soldiers. Very significant change. More aid workers being killed. The guardrails are no longer there. And that really got me thinking about this bigger trend of impunity, not just in war zones, but more widely. Recession in democratic rights, recession in human rights, ends up as recession in property rights. And it's really important because the rules-based order applies internally and externally. The international order was designed to buttress the democratic order at home. And I think that's what's under enormous strain. I think that what's at stake, therefore, is the ability of people to make their own choices. Because in the end, the definition of impunity is that someone else makes the choice for you.
Welcome to Meet the Leader. I'm Linda Lucina, and I am very excited to welcome you into our New York studios at the World Economic Forum for a very special conversation on leadership, this one on accountability. Meet the Leader turns 5 years old this year, and as we have dug into tactics and practical strategies for change, all of that has underpinned a bigger goal: to help leaders and teams tackle the biggest challenges of the day and help changemakers really meet the moment that they're in. These past 5 years have not been easy ones for leaders. They've seen the pandemic, widening economic gaps, climate chaos, and increasing geopolitical instability. David Miliband has thought a lot about these shifts and how they impact people on the ground. He is president and chief executive officer of the International Rescue Committee. That is a global humanitarian organization, one whose founding was inspired by Albert Einstein in the 1930s. And this organization helps give aid and relocation assistance to refugees and people whose lives have been turned inside out by war, conflict, and disaster. He'll talk to us about a trend he's tracked for years, the age of impunity, one where leaders seem less accountable to the power that they yield. We'll talk about that, how it's impacting humanitarian work, and the challenges ahead for leaders of any stripe. Welcome, David. How are you?
Linda, thank you very much for having me. You're so right. It's the moment. Meeting the moment is exactly the right. It's actually the theme of our gala dinner this year.
That's amazing. Well, I love to be on trend.
You're definitely with the moment.
Let's talk a little bit about this for people who aren't familiar. What is the age of impunity, and why is it so important to understand?
Well, I came to this view, this understanding, not through theory, but through practice. Two of our humanitarian aid workers were driving an ambulance across Western Syria, and they were hit by a missile sent by the Russian Air Force that was working on the side of President Assad during the Syrian civil war. And obviously the immediate trauma faces the organization. We've lost 2 staff members. But there's something I learned in politics, which was my previous career. In government, the great advantage is you see the big picture. The danger is you lose sight of the people. When you're running an NGO, as I do today, you're confronted by the people every day. The danger is you lose sight of the big picture. And encapsulated in that, it wasn't a tragedy, it was a crime that afflicted my 2 colleagues, was a bigger picture, which is that in war zones around the world, impunity was the order of the day. Whatever the rules said, whatever the laws of war said, impunity, which is the exercise of power without accountability. Baldwin, former British Prime Minister, said that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. What we saw in that war zone is what we're seeing elsewhere, which is that the guardrails are no longer there. And that really got me thinking about this bigger trend of impunity, not just in war zones, but more widely. And I suppose that's how I came to christen the idea of an age of impunity.
You work with the Eurasia Group on a special report that tracks all this. Can you talk a little bit about the Atlas of Impunity?
Yes, I'm grateful to the Eurasia Group, but also to the funders. I chair the advisory board. So it's an independent report that's done every year. That's the Atlas of Impunity. It measures impunity in every country in the world, more or less, across 5 different dimensions, not just conflict, although that's important, governance, human rights, and then 2 that are maybe give this added originality to this atlas. One is about economic impunity, which is about one thing that's obvious, which I suppose is the exploitation of employees, modern slavery being the worst example of that, but also when states encroach on property rights. That's impunity too. So there's an economic dimension. And the 5th dimension is environment, climate change. We see the abuse of the planet as an example of impunity from one generation to the next, and also from humans to the planet. So we have this scorecard, if you like, that measures impunity. Some things are obvious. You'd expect Afghanistan has very high impunity, Finland has very low impunity. But within that, you have some very interesting trends, and the purpose of the Atlas is to sponsor discussion, debate about this global issue that we perceive.
Tell us a little bit about how long the Atlas has been tracked for and what's gotten better and worse.
Well, next year will be the 4th edition of the Atlas of Impunity. It's quite hard to get the data sets that go far enough back. We have some data that goes back 5 years, 10 years. But with a lot of the data, we use dozens and dozens of different data sets. So it's done in a statistically appropriate way, the 5 measurements or the 5 indices. Here are some things that come out. One is that conflict is actually one of the biggest changes in the last 5 years. So there are 60 conflicts going on in the world today. 5 years ago, there were 39 conflicts. So you've got greater conflict, more and more people displaced by conflict. 5 years ago, about 75 million people, either as refugees or internally displaced. Today, 125 million people. So you've got some change there. You've also seen, I think, some very interesting moves in the middle of the atlas. Saudi Arabia has more accountability than it did 5 years ago. You've seen countries, maybe some surprises. Not every democratic country is at the top of the atlas. Singapore scores above some other countries that could claim to be more democratic. So this is an atlas that gives a different way of thinking about different trends in the world. Some things are common with very serious work like the Varieties of Democracy project at the University of Gothenburg. Freedom House, the United States charity, does very important work about the health of democracy, but that's a subset of this wider set of trends.
And what has, you mentioned that, hey, maybe it's surprising that there are democratic countries there and which ones are maybe higher on the list than others. But what has personally surprised you about maybe some of the changes in the index?
I think that when you factor in environmental impunity, you scramble the scorecard a bit. So a country like Canada suddenly doesn't score as well as you might expect. I think that there are countries in Africa that are high scorers and that are low scorers. It's probably the continent with the biggest spread of the biggest spectrum of performance, if you like, against these indices. I'm also struck that countries can move a long way quite fast. And that's also, I think, striking. We don't know what's going to be in next year's atlas, which will be published slightly later. We want to get more up-to-date data, so we'll publish in July next year for the 2026. My goodness, time flies, the 2026 index.
You have talked a little bit about how the age of impunity has started to evolve into another sort of more difficult age. Can you talk a little bit about that, the age of cruelty?
Well, I certainly think that the two are associated with each other. One of the things that, since I'm running a humanitarian organization, I'm faced every day with the question, well, there are 300 million people in humanitarian need. That means they depend on non-governmental organizations to survive effectively. The World Bank has recently revised up its estimate of the number of people living on less than $3 a day. So the amount of, it's a pretty stark measure of extreme poverty. That's their measure of extreme poverty. 800 million people, 810 million living in extreme poverty. And I think that what we're seeing is that certainly in the world's conflict zones, we're seeing two things that are very, very striking. One is impunity against civilians. So more civilians are killed in war today than soldiers. It's a very significant change. More aid workers being killed. So there's that cruelty. But the second thing that we're seeing is there's this terrible phrase, the tribalization of pain. If it's your tribe that's the subject of cruelty, then it's your problem. If it's not your tribe, then it's someone else's problem. As a humanitarian leader, I say, look, we're the human tribe. And that means, and we were founded by Albert Einstein, the International Rescue Committee, as you rightly pointed out. He founded us as a secular agency, interestingly enough, although the primary job was to help victims of the Nazis, Jewish victims of the Nazis in the main, in the 1930s. But he founded us as a secular agency because he believed in universal values. And I think that's what's under threat as well.
What is needed to change this maybe in the short term? Can it be changed in the short term?
Well, I think that in the very short term, we're obviously facing this very striking phenomenon that the number of people in humanitarian need is going up and aid budgets are going down. We're meeting in the US, but it's not just a US phenomenon. And so I think that the first task really is to make sure that we make the money that we do have go as far as possible. That means focusing on the countries in greatest need, the people in greatest need, the programs that has greatest impact. One of the things I'm most proud of, I mean, we've grown the International Rescue Committee from being a $500 million organization to being a $1.5 billion organization in the last 10 years. We've got smaller this year by about $400 million, so we're dealing with degrowth. Having grown fast, we're now shrinking a bit. But I think that the thing I'm most proud of, one of the things I'm most proud of, is that we're the leaders in impact evaluation. And at a time when aid budgets are going down, it's ironic, we know more about how to make aid go further. And I think we've got a real job to do to achieve that focus on those who are in extreme poverty. We've got to sustain our innovation. I think that's hard to do sometimes when organizations are hunkering down. The danger is that they stop thinking. And we're determined at the IRC to carry on thinking. We see ourselves as the innovation leaders of the humanitarian sector, maybe reflecting back to Einstein. So I think that's really important. But I also think that there's just a fundamental point about, and this is where World Economic Forum the clue's in your name. If those who reap the rewards of globalization don't bear its burdens, then it's not going to survive. And I think that's an important message. That's why I spoke, that's why I go to Davos and why I participate in World Economic Forum activities. I think it's really important that this ethic of shared responsibility is properly defended.
You talked a little bit about innovation. What are some examples of maybe innovative approaches that you guys have applied recently?
Yeah, well, today we're using AI to diagnose monkeypox in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and you can diagnose it in 5 minutes rather than taking 2 weeks. I'm very proud of the work that we've done on acute malnutrition to show how we can have 30% efficiency savings by changing the way in which we diagnose and treat acute malnutrition. I think some of our work on making the humanitarian sector more proactive rather than reactive, using AI to warn farmers about threats to their livelihoods from climate events, we've shown how that allows them to have much greater impact on their lives and livelihoods. I think that's very important. And some of the innovation is not about products, it's about the way we do our business. We work in 4 East African countries where there's a lot of zero-dose kids. In other words, they're not getting vaccinated. And we have a tremendous partnership with the Global Alliance on Vaccines, which has delivered 20 million vaccines to 2 million kids at $2 a shot in areas where they were getting no vaccinations at all because government health systems couldn't reach because of civil conflict. So the way we do our business, I think, is being changed, as well as what the products are that we deliver.
Is there a special role that maybe private sector can be playing that maybe they haven't needed to play in the past, but maybe now it's the moment?
Well, private sector is our risk capital. That's the way I would put it. In some of our most innovative approaches, you don't know if you're going to succeed, and you've actually got to embrace risk and failure. With risks comes the chance of failure, but if you're not failing enough, you're not risking enough. And so our innovation funds pride themselves that they're learning the best of private sector risk appetite. I think that's important. I think that the private capital can be our patient capital as well. Often government funding is short-term. We often say to foundations, look, go multi-year. That's the way to make yourselves distinct, as well as embracing risk. So I think those are important.
Many humanitarian organizations are, trying to create models that are thinking beyond philanthropy. Why is that so important?
Well, I think it's about, by beyond philanthropy, you mean what in this?
Beyond maybe donations alone.
I see, yeah. I mean, we always say share your ideas, share your people, as well as share your funds. And sharing your ideas is what it says. Share your people. We have a fantastic program called Signpost, which is now in 25 instances around the world. It's an information service for displaced people, by displaced people. One obvious issue is cybersecurity. Some of the tech companies have loaned us people to help design so that cybersecurity is there for people. So I think lending your people is important as well. Giving your funds is obviously important, but I think that it's your idea about going beyond philanthropy is to say, make this a relationship, not just a check writing exercise. And what we find with our best private sector partners is that they engage their employees as well, and that motivates them.
Some donor governments have sort of retreated from a variety of organizations, global organizations. Is that, in your mind, is that sort of a weakness in the international system, or do you see it just mostly a failure of political will? Where's the vulnerability?
I did a speech at the University of Notre Dame earlier this month, and I gave a really extraordinary statistic, because you're right, governments are cutting, and nowhere more so than the US, but fully 89% of the US public, yes, 89%, including 84% of Republicans and 94% of Democrats, think that 1% of the federal budget, $1 in 100, should go on overseas aid. 89%. Now, the trouble is, the majority, more than 50%, think that 20% of the federal budget goes on overseas aid. But actually, the vast majority of the American public want the money to be, want 1%, which is more or less the amount that has been traditionally spent by the US Exchequer on overseas aid. And so there's a mismatch there. The Trump administration has made big cuts, but it's been able to do so, I think, because the impression is that there's far more going on overseas aid projects than is actually the case. I don't want to get into the targeting of individual institutions or individual organizations. In the end, it's taxpayers' money. Governments can make their choices. Philanthropic money, philanthropists make their choices. We've had a long-term partnership with governments and with the private sector. We've actually grown. As we've grown as an organization, the share of our income that has been privately raised has gone from about 10, 15% to 30%. Obviously, if government cuts continue, that will carry on. Our point is we can have impact and scale, as the example of the $2 a shot vaccinations suggested. I think it's very sad that 300,000 Afghan boys and girls have lost their education because of decisions that were made in government. The US decided it didn't want to spend any more overseas aid money on Afghanistan. In the end, the price is paid by our clients. 2 million clients have lost access to services in the last 9 months.
Why do you think that gap in understanding still exists? That gap between like what actually is given and what people think?
Well, I think that either we've not been spending enough on communications, or half a truth gets all the way around the world before the truth gets its boots on. And I think there's a lot in that, especially today. I think also one's got to understand that we're not living through a global financial crisis like 2008, but there is a cost of living crisis for a lot of families in advanced industrialized economies. And that has meant people have tightened their belts and expect governments to tighten their belts as well. It's been too easy to hit overseas aid budgets. That's why our emphasis always at the IRC is being the solutions-oriented NGO, because I think people are still in the market for solutions.
How do you see humanitarian aid maybe changing?
I think it becomes more focused. Hopefully it becomes more focused on the extreme poor. It becomes more focused on programs that are proven and cost-effective. I think it becomes more innovative so that it really is at the cutting edge. It would be a double tragedy if the technological revolution passes by the people in greatest need. I think those are the kind of changes that I advocated in this speech I gave at the University of Notre Dame and what we want to see.
In your mind, given all of this, right, given everything that we've seen on the ground with the humanitarian issues, given what you've sort of reflected on the age of impunity, how would you sort of describe maybe the leadership challenge and how the leadership challenge has changed in the last 5 years?
I think that the leadership challenge is to deal with more disorder. It's a more disordered world. I don't think we're living through deglobalization. I think we're living through a more chaotic form of globalization, a more chaotic age of globalization. And so the biggest challenge is that you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. It feels like there's more disorder, and the disorder can come internally, it can come externally. I think that's the biggest challenge.
And how do we bring order?
I think you bring order through consistency. I think you bring order through alliances. I see alliances as sort of buoys that can help stabilize the ship when the anchor's pulled up. I think one also has to recognize that we have to look for orders, plural, not just order, singular. I think there's going to be multiple, the Columbia University Professor Adam Tooze talks about ordering, not just order. And I think that's a clever point. It's not going to be an age of pure order, but the danger is chaos, and that hurts people. And I think we have to be looking for ordering through consistency, through alliances, through keeping the superordinate goals in mind, because it's easy to be tactical, it's hard to be strategic, and the superordinate goal is what makes you be strategic.
If we are able to put in order or orders, if we're able to have a little bit more consistency, what might be different? What might be different maybe in 2030?
There are some known knowns and then some known unknowns. We know that there is a digital revolution of extraordinary reach and meaning that is transforming lives. We know that the rise of the rest is real. America has sustained its share of global GDP in the last 30 years, but Europe, Canada, Japan have lost share of global GDP. So there's a reordering of economic power around the world that I think is translating into shifts in political power. What we don't know is whether coalitions of the willing will be stronger than those who want to flout the rules. And I think that's really important as we look forward.
And if we don't get this order in place, what will happen?
Well, I think that one of the things that I would say, especially speaking to the World Economic Forum, is that recession in democratic rights, recession in human rights, ends up as recession in property rights. The slide doesn't stop at the private sector. And I think that it's easy for people to scorn public-private partnership. I think it's really important. And it's really important because the rules-based order applies internally and externally. The whole point of the rules-based order that was built after 1945 was to safeguard liberal democratic, that means pluralist democracy, but also safeguards of property rights, the international order was designed to buttress the democratic order at home. And I think that's what's under enormous strain at the moment. And I think that what's at stake, therefore, is the ability of people to make their own choices. Because in the end, the definition of impunity is that someone else makes the choice for you.
To build on that, so many people think about geopolitical conflict, even the climate crisis, even though it's been sort of hitting people more and more at home. Some of these things seem so big, they seem like they don't necessarily touch them at home. What should they be thinking about? Why should they be paying attention?
Well, I think that's a great point. I mean, the late Pope, Francis, talked about the globalization of indifference. Now, I think that's not quite right. I think that it's more to your point. People want to make a big difference, but they don't know if they can. And that's why I think this emphasis on solutions is so important. I think that when governments are in retreat from big global problems, you need NGOs, the private sector, to be the solutions merchants, to be the mobilizers of solutions, because I think people are in the market for solutions. Then the question is, how do you give them agency and a sense of really being able to make a difference? And that's why I think the emphasis on what people do together is so important. Alliances are not just between nations, they're also between people.
Not every leader who's listening to this is dealing directly with some of these issues. They might be dealing indirectly with some of these things. But in general, how can any leader be more accountable, right? Can make sure that they are thinking about the biggest picture possible and the biggest impact possible?
Well, you have to think big and small when you're leading. You have to think big and granular. Maybe that's a better way of putting it. I always think that the best accountability is an accountability that's aligned to your mission. It comes back to the superordinate goal. Too often, accountability is for things that, if not peripheral, they're not actually the real bullseye. And I think the most important thing, we exist as an organization to help people whose lives are shattered by conflict and disaster to survive, recover, and gain control of their futures. That's the outcomes that we try and hold ourselves accountable for. And I can say every single program staff member is working to a program with outcomes. Now, obviously, when you're in the leadership level, you've got to make sure that the proxies that you're using are the right ones and that they're actually on the bullseye of what your mission is. I think that's intelligent accountability is mission aligned.
If there was one question that you would want someone to ask themselves to make sure that they're staying mission aligned, what would that be?
The question I ask myself is, am I listening to a broad enough range of people? I think when I was in politics, I learned this. You need a big tent, but you've got to have the flaps open. And if the flaps aren't open, then you're not going to be hearing a wide enough range of views. I think that's really, the great danger of leadership is you get cut off. We have one rule in my office, whether you're an intern or whatever, which is if you've got a question, ask it. Don't be worried that someone will think you're stupid, because first of all, if you've got that question, probably other people do too. And by asking questions, you can find things that are wrong. No such thing as a bad question, I think.
Keeping the flaps open, listening to as many voices as possible. Was there a moment, maybe in the last 5 years, that was really a turning point for you?
I was in Sudan last month, and we got 400 staff working for us in Sudan. It's the biggest humanitarian crisis in the world, as you probably know. There's just been terrible massacres out of El Fasher, the capital of North Darfur, and 400 of our staff, 90% of them are victims of the war themselves. So they've lost their homes, they've lost their jobs. And I spoke to a colleague of mine. She said, well, I lost my home in Khartoum. I was a banker. I lost my job as well. I said, oh, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry about that. She said, no, don't be sorry. I'm a humanitarian aid worker now. And so she'd lost her profession, but she found her purpose. And that sticks with me, I think.
How do you make sure that you're keeping exposed to the widest number of influences?
Well, one can always do better. You never give yourself an A+ for anything. Funnily enough, I'm just talking to my team. We have new country directors. I want to be meeting them. We got the IT department to send a random email every Monday to 10 people in the organization. We were at the time about 16,000 people, to say, tell me what you're doing today. Tell me what I could do to make it better. And things like that, which can seem like a bit of a gimmick, and actually not everyone replies. Some people think it's a fake, it's a fishing expedition. But actually you get interesting stuff coming out from that. A good example of opening the flaps.
What was something that came up from that I wouldn't have known about?
Oh, I think that it was, we've really tried to make our expense module that people were complaining about that wasn't working on our system. There were ideas about how different teams could work together. There was a hunger on the part of staff who were called quote unquote support staff. They wanted to feel more connected to programs. So some things are obvious, some things that are less obvious, that help us get them right.
And what prompted that?
I think it's this thing of, how do you open the flaps? How do you stay fresh? How do you keep in touch with a big organization? I didn't go to business school, but they tell you apparently communicate, communicate, communicate. The danger is that that's just you talking. You can't be a good leader if you're not a good listener, but you've got to make sure that you're listening to the right, to a wide enough range of people.
Well, what are other ways that you create venues and opportunities for listening?
Well, I think that you can't have a listening session if you've got 1,000 people in the room. So you've got to be willing to curate the right kind of forums, the right kind of avenues. I mean, the good thing about internal messaging is that anyone can message you, and sometimes they do. So I think that you've just got to be proactive about it, and I don't think any leader's ever good enough at it. You've got to keep on. You've got to keep on it yourself.
How have you changed as a leader? What's something that you do now that maybe you wouldn't have done?
I think the biggest thing, ironically, is that in-person really matters. There's no substitute for it. Now, we're an international humanitarian aid organization as well as a refugee resettlement agency in America. So we could never have everyone, quote unquote, in the office, in the same office. We always needed to work across time zones, across distance, and the fact that the technology is so much better is fantastic. But like you asked me earlier, what was the conversation I remembered? I remember a conversation in person with the banker turned humanitarian aid worker in Sudan. I didn't say, oh, I remember a really good Zoom call. And it's not Zoom's problem. It's that being in person is when you realize that, or when you hear that someone's got a challenge with their kid who's ill, or someone's moving, or someone's got a real trauma that they're trying to overcome, or someone's got a bigger idea that they didn't know how to put it. So I think that it's really, I don't know, reinforced or enforced that finding time to be in person really matters.
Are there moments at the IRC that you guys really prioritize? Hey, these are the things we do in person.
Yeah. But you know, you can't say to every country director we want to all be in the same room. It's hard because you're taking them away from their work. So we find times to do that. You've got to really prepare to make the most of the time that you have together. And I think, you know, we're all trying to feel our way into this new future. When people say, "Oh, I'm going hybrid," everyone's hybrid these days. The question is, does the online time and the in-person time work to maximum effect? And for creativity, for figuring out risks, in-person can really help.
What do you think leaders will need in the next 5 years to meet the moment?
I think they'll need a bit of luck. There's no question about that. I think I'm big. People say, "Oh, you know, culture eats strategy for lunch." I think strategy frames or creates the context for culture. If your strategy is to hunker down, you need a different culture than if your strategy is to stride forward. And so I'm big on good strategy. I think without that, you're lost. That's your compass.
Strategy that ladders up to your mission.
Yeah. Well, you can't. There's no strategy without. I mean, by definition, the strategy is bankrupt if it's not linked to your mission.
Is there a book you recommend?
I read recently rather a sobering book, but a clever book by a man called Ivan Krastev called The Light That Failed. And it's about what's happened in Eastern Europe since 1990. And it's quite sobering about how democratic norms take root, how they can be upended, how public-private partnership develops, how it gets rolled back. And the light that failed is the idea that there's a single light. One of his argument is that the idea that there was no alternative to open markets, liberal democratic politics, that was really dangerous, and that created a backlash. It's an interesting book.
And how would it change someone who read it?
I think that they'd never say there is no alternative. There are always alternatives. They may be worse, but that doesn't stop people from plumping for them.
Is there a piece of advice that you've always been grateful for?
I think if you overcalculate, you miscalculate. Someone said that, which I think is a good advice.
How has that helped you?
Well, I think it means that if you feel that something's awry, you're probably right. And if you feel that something's right, it gives you the determination to follow through on it.
And your last question, sir. If you could issue one challenge to CEOs attending Davos in January, what would it be?
The challenge would be, what are you doing to bear the burdens of globalization, not just reap the rewards?
Well, thank you very much, David. I very much appreciate you being here today on this very blustery fall day here in New York. And thank you so much to all of our listeners and our viewers. For more video podcasts, check out the World Economic Forum's YouTube page. And for more transcripts of Meet the Leader and our other podcast, Radio Davos, go to wef.ch/podcasts.
Ada yang perdebatan bahawa GST perlu dikembalikan semula kerana ada yang mempertikaikan bahawa SST itu tidak efektif.
Isu buruh kanak-kanak bukan sahaja dalam bentuk fizikal tetapi juga bentuk moden yang lebih licik dan juga terselindung.
Kita tengok buruh kanak-kanak dan ada juga buruh paksa kanak-kanak.
Kumpulan FB dikenali sebagai grup budak-budak sekolah rendah yang didakwa menyebarkan gambar remaja perempuan tidak senonoh telah pun ditutup.
Anda semua telah bersedia.
Strateginya kena cepat, jangan lambat.
Detik penentuan telah tiba. Cabaran kian mendebarkan.
Ada kesalahan yang berlaku.
Pasukan manakah yang akan menjulang kemenangan buat pertama kalinya? Di mana legenda tercipta, jago rakan muda, eksklusif di Astro. Disember ini, Astro dengan bangganya membawakan Sukan Si Thailand 2025 di mana wira kita bangkit menuju kegemilangan. 12 hari liputan langsung menyeluruh, 54 acara sukan. Sokong atlet kita, dengarkan laungan mereka di Sukan Si Thailand 2025 Ever Forward secara langsung di Astro Arena dan Astro Go.
Kementerian Pendidikan bertanggungjawab sepenuhnya terhadap keselamatan murid dan pelajar sewaktu mereka di sekolah.
Malaysia dan Korea Selatan terus memperkukuh kerjasama dalam bidang teknologi hijau dan kecerdasan buatan AI menerusi pelaburan dua syarikat utama Republik itu.
SPRM akan meneliti dan menjalankan siasatan sekiranya dapat unsur rasuah dalam pelaksanaan projek Aerotrain di KLIA yang dilaporkan sering mengalami gangguan perkhidmatan.
Assalamualaikum dan salam sejahtera. Anda bersama saya Nabilah Khalida dan ini Pantau Belanjawan. Kalau kita lihat tahun 2025 telah menyaksikan lonjakan yang ketara dalam pendaftaran kenderaan elektrik ataupun EV di Malaysia. Kalau kita lihat pendaftaran bulanan melepasi 5% daripada jumlah industri dan bilangan pengecas awam semakin bertambah. Namun di sebalik angka ini banyak cabaran struktural dan juga infrastruktur yang masih wujud. Jadi hari ini kita akan membincangkan sejauh mana kita sudah benar-benar bersedia dan apa tindakan yang diperlukan untuk pastikan EV ini bukan sekadar trend tetapi pilihan jangka panjang untuk rakyat Malaysia. Jadi pakar bersama dengan kita pada waktu ini adalah Syamsul Yunus, penganalisis automotif berada di dalam Google Meet, menerusi Google Meet. Selamat pagi Syamsul, Assalamualaikum. Kalau kita nak fahami landscape dan juga ekosistem EV terlebih dahulu, kita lihat data pendaftaran EV terkini sebagai contoh setakat April 2025, pendaftaran EV itu meningkat 79.7% tahun ke tahun kalau kita nak bandingkan dengan tahun sebelumnya, dan EV kini mewakili lebih kurang 4.4% sehinggalah 5.6% daripada jumlah pendaftaran bulanan kenderaan. Dan kita nak tahu adakah angka ini sebenarnya mencerminkan penerimaan sebenar ataupun masa, ataupun kita masih menghadapi jurang penerimaan yang besar di kalangan pengguna biasa. Apa pandangan keseluruhan Syamsul sendiri? Silakan.
Saya rasa kita punya Assalamualaikum salam first of all. Terima kasih menjemput saya. Sebenarnya kalau kita tengok kita punya permulaan dalam journey EV ini masih lagi awal, baru 3 tahun sejak kerajaan mula serius menunjukkan pemberian cuti cukai dan sebagainya. Jadi dalam tempoh 3 tahun tu sebenarnya kita daripada kosong langsung tidak ada jualan EV dan sekarang kita dah hampir mencecah 5% lah. So itu satu angka yang agak sihat, tetapi kita masih lagi saya rasa jauh lagi lah daripada nak kata EV ni dah boleh diterima oleh kebanyakan pasaran. Tapi langkah awal kerajaan tu memberikan cuti cukai sepenuhnya kepada EV telah berjaya menarik minat dua pihak lah, iaitu menarik minat manufacturer yang mula membuka operasi di Malaysia dan menawarkan pelbagai jenis produk. Sekarang saya rasa kita dah ada berpuluh-puluh jenis model EV dalam masa tempoh 3 tahun. Dan sebenarnya dalam tempoh 2 tahun yang lepas ni, 2024 dan 2025, hampir kebanyakan pelancaran kereta adalah model-model EV. Pelancaran model ICE dah semakin berkurangan, kebanyakannya saya rasa mungkin lebih pada 60% adalah pelancaran sama ada EV ataupun hybrid. Dan akibat daripada banyaknya pelancaran-pelancaran ni, jadi banyak keluar di media sosial, juga di media biasa. Jadi maksudnya publicity terhadap EV itu pun dah menjadi banyak dan that's why kita nampak ada satu perkembangan yang agak bagus lah. Nak kata kita ni terlalu laju ataupun tidak juga. Saya rasa agak normal, maybe slightly better than normal. Sebab after 3 years kita sekarang dah mencecah lebih kurang dalam 5%, which is still far away daripada tahap inflection point yang mungkin akan membolehkan EV ni menjadi lebih popular lagi.
Tapi itu berkenaan dengan apa yang kita ada pada waktu ini. Tapi pada pandangan Yusof sendiri, adakah sebenarnya dasar dan juga insentif sedia ada ini sebenarnya cukup untuk terus mendorong dan melonjakkan lagi pengembangan dan juga penjualan bilangan EV itu sendiri?
Okey, sebenarnya kalau kita tengok insentif tahap pertama yang kerajaan bagikan iaitu cuti cukai yang agak mewah untuk semua EV untuk model-model fully imported CBU, itu saya rasa dah tak boleh, macam mana lagi nak tambah lagi, dah memang dibagikan cuti cukai sepenuhnya, 100% tak ada cukai import dan tak ada excise duty. Sudah tak ada apa lagi nak boleh diberikan, dah dibuka pintu seluas-luasnya lah. Tapi of course yang kita semua tahu pintu tu akan ditutup hujung tahun ni dan selepas itu ada lagi 2 tahun di mana cuti cukai yang sama diberikan untuk kereta-kereta yang dipasang secara tempatan, EV yang dipasang secara tempatan. So itu saya rasa adalah satu langkah yang baguslah sebab sama ada EV ni boleh jadi sesuatu yang mampan ataupun sustainable untuk Malaysia ni juga bergantung kepada sama ada kita mahukan industri otomotif di Malaysia ni kekal sihat. Kalau kita macam contohnya macam di Australia, dia orang dah give up on dia orang punya auto industry dan dia bukalah pintu seluas-luasnya untuk semua kenderaan EV import dan dikenakan cukai yang sama aja untuk semua kenderaan EV ke ICE ke. Jadi di sana kita mungkin akan nampak pelonjakan yang lebih besar berlaku. Tapi kalau kita nak tengok jurang utama, antara jurang utama sekarang dalam minda kebanyakan orang sama ada nak pilih EV ataupun nak pilih ICE, kalau kita jujurlah, salah satu dia punya penyumbang utama dia adalah harga minyak yang sangat murah lagi di Malaysia ni. So sekarang ni kita lihat harga budi 95 bawah pada RM2. Jadi ini menjadikan option memilih EV itu bukanlah satu pilihan yang jelas dan terang memberikan kelebihan kepada kebanyakan orang. Sebab rakyat Malaysia saya rasa hampir semua kot masih lagi layak untuk budi 95 dengan tahap 300 liter sebulan. Kalau kata you dalam keluarga ada 4 orang, 2 parents and 2 anak, tu ada akses kepada 1,200 liter petrol, satu jumlah yang saya rasa cukup mewah lah untuk sebarang keluarga. Jadi tak ada kelebihan yang jelas untuk berganjak kepada EV kecuali mereka-mereka yang betul-betul buat kiraan lah. Kalau you betul-betul buat kiraan dan you akan nampak bahawa penjimatan itu tetap ada dalam 25 hingga 30%. Tapi ini memerlukan sebab dia punya penjimatan itu taklah begitu besar. Jadi dia punya return on investment untuk kereta-kereta elektrik ni makan masa agak panjang. So itu yang menyebabkan untuk kebanyakan pembeli mereka masih lagi tak nampak kelebihan besar untuk berganjak ke kereta elektrik. Ini of course berbeza dengan kita punya jiran di utara dan di selatan di mana harga petrol adalah mengikut harga pasaran dan di mana kerajaan di Thailand memang dah membuat keputusan untuk menjadikan Thailand sebagai pusat pemasangan kereta elektrik. Jadi dia bagi insentif-insentif yang sesuai untuk menjadikan kereta elektrik. Sekarang saya rasa hampir 20% dia punya TIV di Thailand. Dan di Indonesia juga nampaknya dah mengatasi kita lah dari segi peratusan TIV. Dan of course kita tahu Indonesia memang akan menggalakkan pembinaan EV tempatan kerana mereka mempunyai reserve nikel antara yang terbesar di dunia. Itu satu bahan yang sangat penting dalam penghasilan bateri. Di mana kita sendiri saya rasa masih lagi belum jelas ke macam mana kita nak teruskan menjadikan local automotive industry ini boleh berdaya saing ke dalam zaman EV. Dari segi insentif lain, saya rasa infrastruktur lah yang paling penting yang sekarang kena ada dan juga polisi.
Syamsul dah mention about infrastructure, tapi tadi itu adalah antara insentif-insentif dan juga dasar yang sebenarnya Syamsul sudah sifatkan sebagai cukup sebenarnya dan luas dikeluarkan ataupun dibentangkan oleh kerajaan sendiri untuk mempercepatkan penggunaan EV di Malaysia, dan itu juga menunjukkan kedudukan kita hampir menyamai Thailand dan juga Indonesia yang juga pada waktu ini sudah ke depan berkenaan dengan sebagai hub pembuatan EV. Tapi ada juga satu concern ataupun kebimbangan di mana kalau kerajaan ada sasarkan 10,000 stesen pengecas menjelang tahun ini sebenarnya 2025, tapi data terkini menunjukkan hanya lebih kurang 5,149 unit pengecas awam yang telah pun dipasang setakat September 2025. Jadi pada pandangan Syamsul, adakah ini sebenarnya cukup untuk sokong lonjakan lebih kurang 40,000 BEV di jalan raya sekarang, dan apa mungkin risiko sebenar sekiranya pertumbuhan EV itu terus meningkat tapi bilangan pengecas semasa tak selaras dengan pertumbuhan EV? Belum lagi kita cakap soal jurang antara bandar dengan lalu anda dan juga antara pemilik rumah landed dan juga strata. Bagaimana Syamsul?
Okay, so soalan pertama sama ada sudah mencukupi ataupun tidak. Kalau kita tengok kebanyakan kita bila kita bercerita tentang pengecas EV ni selalu kita fikirkan pengecas DC, direct current yang laju tu lah. Jarang kita fikirkan AC punya charger. So realiti sekarang ni ialah untuk DC charger yang sebenarnya disasarkan patutnya ada saya rasa 1,000 je kan DC charger, dan 9,000 lagi patutnya AC charger ataupun low speed charger lah, type 2 punya di rumah ataupun di hotel ke di destination. Tapi yang kita tengok sekarang realitinya DC charger dah mengatasi sasaran. Dah lebih 1,000, so dekat hampir 1,800 unit kalau tak silap saya. Tetapi yang AC charger ni menjadi masalah kerana tak banyak operator yang pasang AC charger di hotel, di shopping center dan di destinasi lah, sebab AC charger ni selalunya destination charger untuk you charge overnight bila dah sampai ke destinasi. So dekat situlah di mana kita nampak kemungkinan bila benda-benda macam ni berlaku, kita nampak mungkin polisi yang kerajaan hendak tu diimplementasikan dengan mungkin cara yang tak begitu jelas. Kenapa saya cakap macam tu? Kerana bila kita bercakap dengan charge point operator, dia orang lebih suka untuk install ataupun pasang DC charger yang jauh lebih mahal daripada memasang AC charger yang jauh lebih murah. Yang agak pelik sikit lah, sebab kenapa pula CPO nak install DC charger yang lebih mahal tu? Of course kerana DC charger memang lebih ramai orang suka lah. Sebab yang itu kiranya kalau you guna DC charger tu dah memang perlu sangat lah. Jarang lah you saja-saja nak guna DC charger kalau tak perlu. Ini emang kalau you tanya dengan EV owners lah. Selalunya DC charger kita gunakan dalam perjalanan. Sebab DC charger ni walaupun dia laju dan dia boleh mengecas dengan begitu pantas, tapi orang kata it's not so good for the battery lah, sebab dia menyebabkan tekanan haba yang tinggi bila you charge dengan pantas ni. So you jarang nak guna benda tu everyday, you hanya guna bila dalam perjalanan. Dan that's why you tengok DC charger, dia punya minat dia adalah lebih tinggi. Sebab bila you guna DC charger dah memang terdesak, memang nak kena pakai dah. So they don't mind installing the DC charger and paying for the cost sebab there is more demand. So masalah sekarang ialah AC charger. Ni saya pun pelik juga bila kita mula dapat tahu bahawa AC charger ni dia lagging banyak sangat ke belakang. So kebanyakan numbers yang you cite tadi, yang shortfall tu ialah shortfall untuk AC charger. So contohnya kalau katalah kita tengok AC charger ni, dia selalunya kena ada dekat destinasi, tempat-tempat pelancongan, tempat-tempat orang nak pergi yang kita akan spend overnight. So contoh, saya bagi contoh dekat Cameron Highlands. Dekat Cameron Highlands, kalau you naik atas tu, ada berapa hotel yang ada AC charger. Sekarang ni yang saya nampak yang ada banyak AC charger ialah Copthorne, satu saja hotel di Cameron Highlands. Dan Cameron Highlands ni adalah satu destinasi pelancongan yang sangat penting. So kalau you sebagai EV owner, realistically hanya ada satu hotel je yang you boleh pergi kalau you nak charge overnight. Kalau you nak gunakan DC charger, ada a few lah DC charger dekat Cameron Highlands tu. Relatively low power tapi adalah a few DC charger. So kat situ kita nampak ada huge gap, dan bila kita tanya kepada CPO, dia kata the policy untuk memasang ataupun guideline untuk pasang AC charger dekat hotel, dekat shopping complex, dia jadi susah. Kerana mereka menggunakan guideline yang dia orang adapt daripada installation of telco punya equipment dalam bangunan. So dia punya obviously berbeza requirement untuk telco dengan requirement untuk CPO. Tapi bila dia gunakan peraturan yang lebih kurang sama yang dia adapt daripada telco, tu menjadikan usaha untuk memasang charger di hotel dan di shopping complex ni menjadi lebih complicated, memerlukan banyak kelulusan daripada arkitek dan sebagainya yang menyebabkan kos tu menjadi terlalu tinggi. Boleh lagi, okey lagi kalau kata contohnya you nak pasang 10 charger, mungkin akan memerlukan benda lain pula. Di mana bila you ada like limit lah bahawa banyak charger you boleh pasang, dan the building owner pula nak kena ada, sama ada you nak pasang your own meter, which is so susah, ataupun the building owner bila dia nak pasang banyak charger macam tu di lokasi dia, dia nak kena ada permit untuk menjual elektrik pula kepada CPO, dan CPO nak jual. So dia jadi banyak kerja dan banyak proses dia yang menjadikan benda ni mungkin jadi slow down lah. So there's some streamlining yang perlu dilakukan dari segi implementation. I think the general policy is already okay, the target pun okay, cuma the implementation. And I think benda ni dia memang akan memerlukan sedikit masa sebab kita pun tak ada pengalaman dengan memasang infra EV ni, masih lagi baru. Tapi yang saya rasa penting sekarang ni ialah kita nak kena ubah the mindset. So right now kita belum lagi ada mindset di mana mengecas ni adalah satu hak. Yeah. Sebagai contoh, kalau kita tengok elektrik dengan air ialah satu hak. Kalau kita tengok akta bekalan elektrik, kita nampak bahawa kalau kita memohon bekalan elektrik, PNB kena pasang. Dia nak ke tak nak, dia kena pasang. Tapi bersyaratlah, maksudnya kalau terdapat kos-kos tambahan, maksudnya nak kena pasang tiang ke, you punya keperluan tak adalah besar, nak kena pasang pencawang, itu perlu ditanggung oleh pengguna. Tapi sekarang kita belum ada lagi hak mengecharge. Dan saya rasa salah satu benda awal yang kita kena buat sekarang ialah menghasilkan satu mungkin undang-undang ataupun polisi mengenai hak mengecharge. Yang ini akan bantu kita mungkin spearhead the infrastructure development.
Baik Syamsul, sekarang kita dah faham bagaimana kompleksnya ataupun bagaimana proses dan cabaran sebenarnya untuk mengembangkan penggunaan EV ini. Dari segi stesen pengecas tu nak capai piawaian tu, banyak lagi kerja yang perlu dilakukan. Tapi pada waktu ini kita pun kena berhenti rehat seketika dahulu. Kita kembali selepas ini.
Kerajaan Negeri Selangor akan melancarkan program pemberian vaksin influenza secara percuma di 4 daerah yang mencatatkan kadar jangkitan tertinggi. Pemilik atau pemandu kenderaan asing, khususnya dari Singapura, yang gagal memiliki atau mengaktifkan permit kemasukan kenderaan VEP tidak dibenar keluar Malaysia selagi tidak membayar saman. Kekerapan gangguan perkhidmatan aerotrain di lapangan terbang antarabangsa Kuala Lumpur KLIA tidak boleh diterima.
Belum tukar box lagi ke? Sebab nanti dah tak boleh nak stream on demand. Tak ada kontrak, pasang pun percuma. Boleh menang barangan perkakas rumah dan pelbagai hadiah menarik.
Astro Ultra Box ni sangat senang digunakan sebab walaupun hujan, saya dapat menonton dengan tanpa gangguan. Saya suka stream Disney Plus dengan cucu-cucu saya.
Dengan box baharu, boleh stream pelbagai aplikasi yang dah termasuk dalam pakej anda. Tunggu apa lagi? Nak menang? Tukar sekarang.
Baik, bertemu kembali dalam Pantau Belanjawan dan kita masih lagi dalam perbincangan berkenaan dengan masa depan EV, antara cabaran dan juga realiti. Dan kita masih lagi bersama dengan tetamu kita Syamsul Yunus, penganalisis automotif. Kalau kita nak bercakap soal hasrat Malaysia nak bina ekosistem EV ini dan juga rantaian nilai tempatan untuk jangka panjang, kita lihat pelaburan automotif itu sebanyak 13.9 bilion ringgit yang diluluskan pada tahun 2024 di bawah strategi NIMP 2030. Pada pandangan Syamsul sendiri, adakah apa mungkin langkah strategik dan juga risiko utama untuk bangunkan pembuatan komponen, pemasangan bateri dan juga R&D itu sendiri di Malaysia supaya kita tak menjadi sekadar negara yang mengimport, kita nak juga ekspor? Silakan Syamsul.
Okey, baik. Ini memang satu soalan yang masih lagi belum boleh dijawab oleh Germany, masih belum lagi boleh dijawab oleh Jepun, masih lagi belum boleh dijawab oleh Korea ataupun Amerika Syarikat. Kerana buat masa sekarang ni realitinya dominasi rantaian bekalan oleh China adalah sangat besar. Kalau kita tengok sekarang ni jenama Jepun lah yang kita kata antara jenama yang mampu milik Jepun dan Korea, mereka pun tidak boleh bersaing dengan jenama China di China. Jadi kalau sekarang kita tengok masih dia orang tengah mencuba untuk bersaing lah. So kita dah nampak dia orang mula take part in cost price reduction. Dan sekarang ni kalau kita tengok harga-harga kereta Jepun, contohnya kalau kita tengok Toyota Camry sekalipun yang dijual di China, harganya adalah lebih rendah daripada harga yang dijual di Jepun. Jadi bila kita bertanya dengan orang industri, dia kata itu boleh dilakukan kerana China, kerana Toyota, Honda, Nissan yang semua ada kilang di China, mereka menggunakan rantaian bekalan China dan of course tenaga kerja di China lah. Satu hal gaji dan imbuhan sebagainya iaitu di China mungkin lebih kompetitif, tetapi juga kos komponen adalah jauh lebih kompetitif di China. Itu yang membolehkan mereka menghasilkan kereta elektrik untuk pasaran China tapi hanya boleh dilakukan di China. Mereka tak boleh lakukan itu di Jepun dan hantar ke sana sebab memang tak ada cost competitiveness buat masa sekarang. Ini bukan saja Jepun, realitinya kita tengok syarikat automotif. Nah, kalau kita kata Toyota nombor 1, Volkswagen nombor 2, Volkswagen pun melakukan benda yang sama, iaitu mereka telah memindahkan banyak juga operasi pemasangan dan reka bentuk. Bukan setakat pemasangan lah, reka bentuk kereta elektrik mereka ke China. Kerana kalau kita fikirkan macam mana Prodor buat kereta, dia adalah sama juga. Dia pun terpaksa pergi ke China untuk melihat rantaian bekalan di China dan mengambil komponen daripada sana. Komponen-komponen utama, terutamanya contohnya motor, BMS dan juga dengan juga bateri, terpaksa didapatkan daripada China. Jadi untuk Malaysia sebagai satu negara yang kecil, saya fikir ini adalah satu tugasan yang agak mencabar jugalah untuk semua badan-badan yang terlibat lah, MITI, MIDA dan sebagainya. Sebab kita kena, dia punya key benda yang kita kena lakukan sekarang ni, sebab kereta kita dah boleh buat. Kalau kita nak buat kereta, kebanyakan supplier dah boleh supply komponen-komponen biasa yang kita gunakan untuk kereta ais. Boleh buat metal stamping, boleh buat casting untuk suspension komponen dan sebagainya. Tapi yang kita belum ada ialah komponen besar iaitu bateri, motor dan juga BMS itu. So ini antara dia punya key steps yang perlu dilakukan ialah kena mulakan dengan menarik 3 key komponen ini datang ke Malaysia. Jadi bila kita tengok Prodor punya niat untuk memulakan tersebut, saya rasa inilah satu langkah yang patut kita ambil. Cuma persoalannya sama ada kita akan berjaya untuk menarik minat manufacturer of this key component untuk masuk ke Malaysia. So ini berbalik kenapa saya katakan tadi langkah awal kerajaan membuka pintu seluas-luasnya untuk memancing OEM masuk ke Malaysia untuk menilai pasaran kita adalah satu langkah yang cukup bagus. Dengan membuka pasaran kita seluas-luasnya with zero import tax dengan zero excise duty, manufacturers macam BYD, macam Tesla, macam GWM, macam Chery, semualah boleh masuk ke Malaysia ni dan melihat sendiri potensi pasaran EV di Malaysia. Dan setelah 3 tahun saya rasa dia orang ada nampaklah potensi tersebut. Cuma sekarang memerlukan polisi jangka panjang oleh pihak kerajaan di Malaysia. Dan antara satu benda yang saya rasa kita boleh lakukan yang banyak dilakukan di Eropah walaupun sekarang mendapat tentangan yang besar ialah menetapkan tarikh akhir di mana boleh penjualan untuk kereta pembakaran sepenuhnya akan dibenarkan dengan biasa. Selepas tarikh tersebut mungkin akan dikenakan cukai yang lebih punitif untuk carbon emission lah untuk kereta-kereta ais. Ataupun just more punitive carbon emission selepas tarikh-tarikh tertentu yang akan menyebabkan pemanufacturer akan fokus lebih kepada hybrid dan kereta elektrik. Di Eropah sekarang tarikhnya ialah 2035 dan mendapat bantahan yang agak keras di Eropah. Kita di Malaysia juga kena fikirkanlah satu tarikh, saya rasa 2035 antara 2035 sampai 2040 tu adalah tarikh yang bagus untuk kita tetapkan sebagai tarikh akhir lah untuk penjualan kereta-kereta enjin ais sepenuhnya dengan sebarang insentif. Ini bukan sebab kerajaan perlu memberikan satu gambaran bahawa kita dah tetap dengan kita punya polisi, membolehkan syarikat-syarikat kita membuat perancangan jangka panjang dan juga peraturan seperti ini akan membantu semua orang dapat mengatur perancangan mereka dengan lebih baik. On the flip side, kalau tidak ada sebarang deadline, maksudnya it's free for all. Market jadi bebas untuk semua, everybody akan ambil keadaan ataupun ambil bayangan look and see lah. Dia akan fikir, okay, look and see, tengok apa yang berlaku. Jadi bila market tu free for all, basically it's like survival of the fittest. Law of the jungle lah, dah tak ada peraturan, ikutlah bila you nak masuk, ikut suka you. Jadi dalam semua keadaan, apabila tidak ada peraturan, apa yang berlaku ialah yang paling kuat yang akan menang. Dan bila kita kata macam tu, dan dia punya obvious conclusion ialah the Chinese brands yang akan menguasai pasaran elektrik di Malaysia ni di masa depan kalau kita tidak ada all these gates ataupun deadline yang kita set untuk membolehkan jenama-jenama lain juga ambil serius pasaran kita. Buat masa sekarang yang kita nampak, jenama China saja yang betul-betul serius dengan pasaran kereta elektrik kita di Malaysia ni. Dan Tesla lah, dua je lah. Buat Tesla pun dibuat di China juga. So ada satu perubahan yang perlu dilakukan dari segi polisi untuk menjadikan kita punya pasaran ini tak sekadar menjadi import market ataupun tak menjadi dumping ground untuk kenderaan-kenderaan daripada China.
Okey Syamsul, kita berbakikan lebih kurang 3 minit tapi saya nak tanya juga 2 soalan berbakikan masa ini. Mungkin kalau kita lihat dengan peningkatan bilangan EV ini, kita nak cakap selepas penjualan itu, adakah bengkel dan juga juru teknik tempatan kita mempunyai kemahiran EV yang secukupnya? Ni kita nak sentuh berkenaan dengan apabila kita menguruskan bateri kenderaan sebab kita tahu bukan mudah sebab kita deal dengan keselamatan voltan yang tinggi dari segi penyelenggaraan itu dan pelupusan itu sendiri. Adakah kita bersedia dan bergerak ke hadapan, adakah kita akan menyaksikan harga EV ini akan menjadi yang lebih affordable, mungkin menyamai dengan MyV ataupun apa pandangan Syamsul sendiri? Lebih kurang 2 minit, silakan.
Okey, saya rasa memang belum cukup lagi mekanik yang boleh menguruskan kereta elektrik. Ini kita masih belum lagi nampak usaha besar-besaran untuk melatih mekanik EV. Jadi itu satu lagi polisi yang perlu adalah. Tapi benda-benda tu semua again kena ada long term polisi kerajaan, benda-benda tu semua akan ikut. Dan kalau kita tengok EV ini, harga EV di China dah memang harga dia dah lebih rendah daripada harga ICE. In fact di China harga hybrid pun dah rendah lagi daripada harga kereta biasa. Jadi memang kita tahu in the long run EV akan menjadi lebih murah daripada kereta ICE dan tak pelik kalau dianya boleh menyamai harga kereta-kereta mampu milik yang ada sekarang. Walaupun Hazia sekalipun, bukan setakat MyV dan Saga sekalipun, kita mungkin akan nampak kereta-kereta pada harga tersebut kerana kereta-kereta tersebut sudah pun wujud di China pada harga-harga tersebut.
Okey, nice. Terima kasih ucapkan kepada Syamsul Yunus, penganalisis automotif, dan sudah tentu EV membawa potensi besar untuk transformasi automotif, alam sekitar dan juga tenaga di negara kita. Tapi kejayaan itu bergantung pada penyelarasan dasar, industri, infrastruktur dan juga rakyat itu sendiri. Jadi terima kasih ucapkan sekali lagi pada Syamsul Yunus dan saya Nabila Khalida. Kita jumpa lagi dalam Pantau Belanjawan akan datang.
Racism in Malaysia is not just a social issue, it is deeply entrenched in our institutions and our policy making.
How come every other time there is something that is triggering?
Whenever there is a heavy vehicle collision,